The last time we were together, I was talking about certain ways by which structuralist criticism could be made, and I was referring to Roland Barthes' example of the use of certain strategies of doing structuralist readings, precisely as regards the narrative. Now, I talked about the functions, what he called functions, the fact that we have distributive functions projected through linguistic items in a prose fiction. And then we also have the indices, what he calls indices, things that show a particular trend, a particular motif of events, of issues, of character, of a number of items that could occur within the prose fiction. Now, I want to proceed on Barthes, the Barthian way of looking at a structuralist criticism of narrative. Well, when I said Barthian, you might wonder what I meant. Well, it's kind of making Roland Barthes, that word Barthes, his surname, an adjective, a Barthian approach, like when we say a Shakespearean approach. Now, a Barthian approach of structuralist criticism will also involve what he called a kind of segmentation of action. Now, when we talk about action in a prose narrative, you will understand that actions are always moments of very, very important, you may say, topical events that happen within the plot of the narrative. The plot of the narrative, will be very much more important to a structuralist than the story itself, because the plot gives us a kind of design. It already gives us a kind of structure. It gives us a motif, a kind of engineering of what is being built as regards the storyline. So if we are looking at the action, you will be looking at certain kinds of events, some markers, certain elevations or digressions that are very much important within the storyline. What you just look for along that line might just involve looking at certain grammatical fields, like you are looking at, let's say, certain things like sentence types. You are looking at some clausal types. You are looking at certain kinds of phrases that give the indication of the action. You can also trace the movement of the action, by deciphering certain particular grammatical elements. Now, by the way, one of the people that really informed Roland Barthes in doing this kind of criticism, I must have probably told us, is a critic called Vladimir Prop. Prop, in his own critique, structuralist critique of narrative, he looked at what he called sequences. And Barthes, like I told us, he gained from that scholar, he gained from this scholar to appropriate his own focus of structuralist reading. I use the word reading, also meaning critique, structuralist critique. Now, when doing structuralist reading, sequences will give us certain forms of what we can itemize in words, in language. For example, if you are looking at certain actions that have to do with cheating or politicking, or you are looking at things that have to do with relationships, urban relationship of youth, and you are also looking at maybe the progression of certain issues of youth cultural interest. Let's say, for example, the breaking out of a particular group of boys within a school, breaking out not in the sense of violent breaking out, but in the sense of a kind of breaking out, making a kind of personality distinction from what they felt they were getting on campus, and they want to break out, let's say, into a hip-hop group or whatever the case. You know that the sequence of that narrative, it's going to give us a form of, naturally, when reading the novel, a form of heightened impulse. The linguistic parade that occur, that cover that kind of scenario, is what a structuralist will be looking at. You are looking at actions within sequences of what really transpires and then you find out clusters of grammatical constructs that are able to give us this, and those also that can give us the actual meanings of those actions, so that within the field of structuralist criticism, you are concerned about elements of grammar, elements that have to do with the morphological elements, the word formation elements, the syntactic elements, the way the grammar comes into construction. You are looking at the semantic. You are looking at the phonological. There are times when you can gain certain entry into perhaps a kind of surprise within the prose fiction through certain, maybe homonyms, certain forms of sounds that give some indications of perhaps a twist of event or perhaps a particular topical issue going on there. Okay, all these things are highly important. They are very, very important. You are looking at a number of elements that can project, okay, the meaning, the particular meaning that narrative is giving to, the whole reason for its being written. If we look at these elements too, we can also construct our own structuralist readings of a number of things. For instance, if I were to take a particular poem, let's say I want to take a poem like W.B. Yeats' Second Coming, I might be very interested, for example, okay, the way it is constructed. That poem does not go, even though it is in stanzaic form, about 2 stanzas, so to speak. The stanzaic form is such that the first stanza is a form of run-on event. It's something that doesn't have end rhymes, it doesn't have couplets or whatever the case may be. It's just running one into the other. That kind of motif, okay, can be brought out as a way in which a sentence is not absolutely finished on a line, it just keeps running on. It might be telling us about the urgency of what W.B. Yeats is saying about a kind of end time. Well, something that has to do with the underbelly, so to speak, of modernism. How somehow the events of a modernist progression, okay, of society is actually dissembling civilizations, turning order into chaos, turning a number of things, motifs into chaos. And apart from that, you can bring out certain words that can be identified as grim, making the whole poem a kind of dirge, a kind of poem that is really bringing out the sordid, bringing out the alarming, bringing out the shocking, bringing out what makes for distress. There are certain metaphors that are brought out there. For example, when it talks about the beast that suddenly appears, okay, and then that beast, okay, resembles the beast in the book of Revelations, okay, in the Bible, but then it is somehow co-opted with the millennial reign of Christ, that the very second coming, which in the actual biblical event should bring peace to the world. But then the beast is substituted for this to mean that a kind of doom to the world that is triggered by civilization. You can look for metaphoric words or metaphoric phrases that have certain indices of disaster, that have indices of shock, that have indices of alarming disharmony in society, which brings about the idea of an end time. End time, not in the sense of the Bible, talking about the final end of man, but then end time, perhaps of human innocence, end time of human ability to control human environment, end time of order, end time of governance, even the idea that we can call a particular form of governance to a position where we could believe in it. It's a kind of shattering thematic that we find when we begin to draw out a structuralist analysis of a poem like W.B. Yeats. You can go and read it and put your hand on it. Look at the phonological input of certain words there and how they play on the imaginary of mood and of actual events that eventually come out to be distressing within that kind of poem. Having said this, we want to look at the strengths and the weaknesses we may find in structuralist criticism. Let's start with the strength. Number one of the strengths of structuralist criticism is that it puts literature within the orbit of language. The fact that it is a verbal construct and it brings out the mechanisms that we may find out as engineering, the potency of rhetoric, the power of communication. It gives us the underlying mechanisms, just like giving us the engine that runs a particular vehicle. When you want to dismantle the engine or tell us what really works within the construct of the engine, you are not going to be looking at the engine as a whole anymore, which will be our own kind of looking at literature. You will be looking at things like maybe the plug system. You might be looking at the elements that allow for acceleration. You might be looking at, that cavity that allows, the fluidity of the petrol and the water, how the ignition happens and things of that nature. Those are the things that language gives us in structuralism to be able to appreciate literature. Another big strength of structuralist criticism is that somehow it becomes an ideological position of reading literature away from a bourgeoisie handling, a bourgeoisie province of criticism. Let me come a little bit clearer. It seems to take literature away from the control of just a high-class cream of critics and criticism that take away the opportunity of personal objective reading through the structures that allow literature to be itself. Another thing is that literature becomes something of a text that perhaps when you understand the elements of the structure of the literature, you have a kind of blueprint of easily understanding the issues within that literature. And we have a number of things like that that allow us to see literature within a compacted structuration that allows deductive reasoning to come up within our literary analysis. Having said this, we want to look at certain obvious elements of weakness in structuralist criticism. The first major attack against structuralism is that it brings literature down to the point of mechanistic examination, a kind of situation in which literature becomes reduced to a kind of almost lifeless mechanism, as a number of anti-structuralist critics will say, that it brings literature to a kind of pedestrian, mechanistic way of looking at literature as a kind of body that can just be sliced into pieces without a potent life in it. That if you are to go the way of the structuralist critics, you are going to take the life out of literature, because we are only going to be concerned about how a particular grammatical element coheres with another one, and therefore you are making a deduction of what this means rather than enjoying the story, feeling the transmission of literary currency within your, imaginative streams, takes you away from the world of the humans that the literature brings to you, or the world of the environment that literature brings to you. That's number one. Number two is that structuralist criticism, just like the formalist, denies the influence of culture, of the environment, of the social life that is consistent with a literary field, and reduces the whole thing to a kind of structure you look at like a cadaver, like a dead thing. By extension, it makes literature, so to speak, dead to the reader. the text dies to the reader instead of the reader actually warming up to the text. It therefore takes away potential readers from the enjoyment of literature. It turns literature into a science that can only be approached from a kind of morbid anatomy motif. It's like the body you are really looking at the end of the day is consigned to a kind of critical death, and then you are bringing out what made it up, okay? Instead of finding a very, very impacting electric body that breathes into another life, who is the reader, and generates a whole lot of new meanings that can make society and the literary event a very enjoyable field of display. Then you must notice this too. In structuralism, the author is effaced. In fact, the author, just like you find in formalism, is actually silenced. There is, to the structuralist, no reason and no relevance for the author to be seen as part of the meaning-making mechanics or meaning-making contributors to the text, okay? And also it takes the author away from, the life of the production arena of the text. By extension, structuralism also homogenizes the reader. In other words, the reader is just a kind of statue, a human being, even though there are many, that must understand literature within a particular format of a mechanistic science of structural meaning derivation, so that the bulk of the readers become homogeneous, having no life of themselves to make meaning. In other words, the text becomes devoid of being understood as a commentary on society, maybe in the area of politics or gender relations or the power relations of a particular a dominant force in relation to a marginal force. So it takes the life of the literary event away from the readers of the event, and by extension also makes the readers a pulp of reading. In other words, the readers themselves are reduced to lifelessness because they must read within the pattern of a science, of a manual, okay, of reading literature from a very scientific matter that allies more to the natural sciences, maybe the laboratory of those that do the analysis of human blood, human veins, and all those things, okay? But taking literature away from the circulation of the stream of social dynamics. A big flaw of structuralist criticism is the assumption that society, politics, cultural dynamics are devoid from structuralism. Interestingly, structuralism itself is a response to the politics of the day in France, as at the time, right from the post-war period, that was responding to the bourgeois pretensions, okay, of somehow making literature always already determined as an elite kind of consumption. By extension, structuralism in making literature a particular element that can only be penetrated by highly skilled intellectuals that are schooled in the ideology of structuralism eventually makes the structuralist an elite intellectual. You can call him a new bourgeois intellectual of the left, in the sense that you cannot penetrate literature without the tools it prescribes. And that very tool, if you look at structuralism, if you've ever read it in any text at all, I wonder if you understand it immediately. It is so far off from, the common man to understand. It's so esoteric when you encounter it as a layman for the first time, okay? It's so meaningless, so to speak, so problematic, so problematizing, so complex, so abstract, so to speak. If you are operating at that, and by extension telling other forms of knowledge producers to go your way, you are by extension also inaugurating a very bourgeois form of intellectual submission that is perhaps even worse than the bourgeois academic, scholarship that they were actually antagonizing. If we look at it more and more, structuralism also takes away the peculiarities of reading processes. It takes away the fact that readers can look at things from different perspectives, and it also takes away the world of textuality. The text becomes ossified, it becomes homogenized, it becomes a kind of one-way thing that does not allow its textuality, doesn't allow its dynamism of several forms of impact, several kinds of meaning it could have to different audiences. It also ignores the fact that texts are within themselves, just like Frederick Jameson tells us in his very popular book, The Political Unconscious, that every discourse in society, anything that has to do with a social space, is always inscribed in politics, whether we know it or not. So it will encourage us to always historicize, because there is nothing unconscious about anything that happens in society that doesn't have its political affiliation. Texts have their political focuses. They have their political, let's put it in a more familiar word, they have their different foci, of being read. I could be reading, for example, a William Shakespeare, if I choose, from a formalist perspective that is just, taken by the language, the use of puns, the way characters interact, and so on and so forth, because I just enjoy the aesthetics, so to speak, of the presentation. But somebody like Aimé Césaire or somebody like Isiaba Irobi, who wrote a counter-textual presentation to The Tempest in Sycorax, that is the title of his play, he will be denied the opportunity to look at Shakespeare from a post-colonial perspective, that is, looking at Shakespeare as a kind of colonialist text that inscribes a whole lot of Manichaean allegory, just like a famous critic puts it, Abdul-Jan Mohammed. He was the one that talked about the economy of Manichaean allegory, where he states that in colonialist literature, you almost always find a binary opposition of the element of characters, the element of spatiality, and even discourses. You have binary oppositions, so that there is, within that kind of text, we can allege that Shakespeare was constructing, a metropolitan space of white supremacist privilege against the other, that is, those that were subjected to colonialist superimposition through their traveling into other worlds and making them their colonies. It disallows that kind of thing. So, and we also can say that structuralism does not permit a kind of reading that can also engage other texts. It disallows the fact that certain texts involve some other text or affect some other text, to become what they are. It just looks at the text as a kind of structure that must be looked at from its formal linguistic elements. And when we look at this very well, it makes us to see that there are certain gaps within structuralism. However, true to all theories or critical instruments of looking at literature, structuralism has definitely its own strengths, its own inputs to the wonders and the transformations of literature today that allows us to see a number of new perspectives of writing. For example, within structuralism, we know that we can really talk about certain cogent grammatical elements, certain cogent linguistic systemic happening within literature. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really wonderful talking with you today, and I believe you'll be here for the next title that'll be coming up, post-structuralism. So please like this channel, share it with others, let it go round, subscribe to it, drop your questions, let's work together. Thank you very much.